people coming in, if people could maybe move a little bit together. So a little bit Tibetan Indian style. Not to have 1 meter around you or something. Thank you so much.
This is there.
Also for the people who just arrived, there's a lot of space over here. Yeah. And if people could give up the small cushions, some people have 2 or 3. Thank you so much.
Geshela will start this session by reciting a prayer, refuge in Tushita. So the meaning of the words of this prayer is, until I'm enlightened, I take refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and the Sangha. Through the merit I generate by practicing giving and so forth, may I become a Buddha for the benefit of all sentient beings. So Geshela will recite this in Tibetan 3 times.
Sophie Jonam Zanchu Badu Dani Kyapsuchi Dari Jinso Dipe Somanki Rola Benchi Sangye Rupashu Chodam Sophie Jonam Zanchu Badu Dani Kyapsuchi Dari Jinso Dipe Somanki Rola Benchi Sangye Rupashu Sangye Jonam Sophie Jonam Zanchu Badu Dani Kyapsuchi Dari Jinso Dipe Somanki Rola Benchi Sangye Rupashu.
Kazangi Cho, Ichini, Nukoboyo Juki, Zawashira, Gabjin Shibana, Gabani, Teaching Chavachuaka, Tene Tomani Shes, Tene Tabo, Tene Mumina House, or Tatsishi soon. Tatsita Bogi, that teaching Chavachuaka, Tene Tomani Shes, Titandari Takaza, Shibutore.
continue with the teachings from yesterday. So in relation to that, Nagarjuna said in his fundamental wisdom in the 24th chapter, that which is dependently arisen is explained to be emptiness. That being dependently imputed is the middle way. So with regard to the first two lines, that which is dependently arisen is explained to be emptiness, while Geshela already explained that yesterday. So with regard to these two lines, these first two lines, that which is dependently arisen is explained to be emptiness. Now in particular with regard to emptiness, from the point of view of emptiness, Geshela yesterday used the example of the scissors. So he said, okay, so I should better get out those scissors. So with regard to those three parts that these scissors are made of, we can all understand that none of those parts are the scissors. And we also know that there is nothing else other than those three parts. There's no other entity or no other phenomenon that we can point at as saying that those are the scissors. So therefore, since we cannot find anything to point at with regard to what the actual scissors are, so therefore we can say the scissors do not exist in reality or in and of themselves. So therefore, saying that it doesn't exist, that in reality they don't exist, these scissors, well then emptiness is quite easy, really easy, it can be easily understood. And then with regard to another object other than the scissors, if you take the eye, if you take the self, well then it's a little bit more difficult, but nonetheless it's not that hard to understand that the eye is none of the aggregates, it's not the collection of the aggregates, it's not any single aggregate, so that's actually also not that hard to understand. So if that is emptiness, then the kind of idea you may come up with is that emptiness is actually not that difficult. If that's not hard to understand, then someone may say emptiness is not that hard. So then, therefore, the great Kadamba master called Drumdamba, so with regard to him, he explained that those who know emptiness, those who realize emptiness, they will be able to generate compassion, they will be able to reduce their afflictions and so forth. And in response to that, a disciple said to Drumdamba, well, why is it then there are not that many people who realize emptiness? There are not that many people that we know have realized this. No, talking to the Geshe
Tony to Shingi, Tony Dawson, in a video zone, Chekandi,
Sorry, I misunderstood. So Geshela said that actually someone said to Drumdamba, well, actually, if it's why is it that there's still so many people they can talk about emptiness, but they still have afflictions, etc. And so Geshela says, well, this is just emptiness that comes from the mouth. in the sense that they haven't really understood it. They may be able to talk about it, etc., but they haven't really realized it, fully understood it, so that it becomes an antidote to their afflictions. So once you have a sense from deep within your mind, a deep understanding of emptiness, then your mind will change. That is, your afflictions will be reduced. There will be some change. So there's a story of someone who learned, who kind of thought about emptiness a lot. He hadn't really studied about it much, but he had trained himself in emptiness, as in like he has thought about it a lot. And so at some point, when he experienced some fear in his mind, he started analyzing what is it that is experiencing this fear. So he started searching for that entity, and as a result of that, not being able to find anything, his fear was reduced. And so there are stories of those who meditate, for instance, for 20 days on emptiness. So previously, of course, they learned about emptiness, they studied about it, and then they did some retreat on that. And as a result of doing this retreat, they then shared this experience they had, saying, well, previously someone harmed me and I got angry, I got upset, but actually that doesn't make sense. It's embarrassing that I reacted in that way because of the understanding that they had. So that shows that their meditation was effective to some degree, that it actually affected their mind because of saying what Geshela said, so that they had been affected in that way, that they thought it was wrong that they reacted to the harm of another person in that way.
And then
there's another story of a monk who had even meditated more on emptiness, more than the person that Geshela mentioned before. So he had meditated even more on emptiness, learned more about it. So, in general, we consider ourselves to be more important, and we forsake the welfare of others because of the sense of ourselves being so important. So with regard to the sense of I am so important, so taking Geshela as the example, so with regard to Geshela's I, that refers to the person sitting here on this throne. So this person, so Geshela taking himself as the example, so himself, Geshela saying that I myself feel to be so important, I consider myself to be so important, while another person, I consider them to be less important. Well, why is that? We're actually the same. I want to be happy and don't want to suffer, and the other person wants to be happy and does not want to suffer. So why is there that difference in terms of considering one to be more precious than the other? So if we analyze this well, if we examine this well, we come to the conclusion that the reason for why this is more precious is because this is I and this is not I. So that is the reason for considering ourselves to be more precious.
Marangi do che shower mato, dengi when we need to tone, the yo do sit that there is some sort of. Did you do that? Digi you are changing in jail, the Dutch woman, kid you need any. Your machine kitchen, Toma Mevel, Koyalo to the social charity. DJ Goedi, Mama, the Ding Alice, you are DJ. The Dio Marangulo truly cherry model, doing in the city your marriage, the Jamba Tahara, and call a single to the cigar. That another to me, Koyawater, and much everything, Norcia, somebody in the corner, and some little destiny to do that.
So with regard to this situation where we differentiate between ourselves and others, so if we think about emptiness with regard to this particular, or the sense of being different, ourselves differentiating between ourselves and others, if we really think about it, then we come to the conclusion that this difference is only created by the mind. It cannot be found from the side of the object. And so the sense of differentiating, of considering one person closer to yourself, so the eye is kind of closer and the other person is further away, well, we're basically born with that. Not only are we born with this, we've had that sense since beginning of time. We naturally have that sense. But then if we think about this, if we consider this and examine this, we can come to the conclusion that we're mistaken about this, that this is not in accordance with reality, and thus once we understand this, that this is just coming from the mind, this is just from the point of view of the appearance to the mind, that there's this differentiation, then it is said that this feeling, that naturally a feeling of closeness is generated. Understanding our own mistakes, we feel naturally closer to another person. We understand that we were wrong and develop some sense of closeness. This is how it's explained. So therefore, if we think about this again and again, once our mind is affected by this way of reflection, by that type of reflection, then a special feeling with regard to this idea will arise. So it's difficult, of course, to generate that kind of feeling, but actually, in comparison to other things, it's not that difficult. And as Geshela explained before, if you become familiar with this idea that the object is not findable, etc., well then after some time it's actually not that difficult to get a sense for that. But what is more difficult, what is actually harder than that, is to get an understanding of how the scissors exist. So saying that the scissors do not exist in this way, but then the question is, what is the scissors? How does it exist? That is harder to understand. We can't say it's not there, it doesn't exist. So actually it's not, actually from deep within, we don't actually think it's not really there. But actually there are those that feel when we talk about phenomena do not exist from their own side, it means the same as of saying they don't exist. So they believe that those mean the same thing, not existing from their own side and not existing at all. So actually they just say from the mouth basically, they just kind of have a superficial sense that phenomena do not exist, that the scissors do not exist. Because if you were to ask them, is therefore fire not hot? Is water not cold? And you were to ask them to put their hand in fire, like to touch their hand, touch the fire, they won't do it because from deep within there's no sense that it's non-existent, that fire is not hot, for instance. If I say I don't talk, I don't speak, I don't exist as being speaking, that's there's a contradiction by saying so, saying that that doesn't take place. It's the same as saying I'm not speaking. Like saying I don't speak is like I don't speak is the same as saying I'm not speaking, but actually it's Geshe is speaking.
제산다 왜 세네니가 뭐래 무인이스 네바디 다 타셔주고래 네 라마도 같이 요래스 다 디기 렌디카 디지도 아니 신의 미담미담 this things are to go.
So basically, when we search for an object, when we look for an object, we cannot find it. But then what is difficult is to establish how it exists. So there are different explanations with regard to how it exists, and we're moving on to a subtler level, a deeper kind of level, when explaining how phenomena then exist.
다 디가나 무인이스 다 지워지 무인이스도 매나 하나 간데스 통보하랬어. 먼저 디리 같이 쟁거랬어.
And on top of that, the question that arises is if the objects do not exist in reality, well then, how do we perceive them? How come we think about objects? How come that we can perceive them, we can see them?
디르도 그 차시에다 무매기 바차 소시스는 바차 요거다 유기도 차시죠. 디르 때문에 이로를 되지 우리는 매네 통해요. 배나 다 토요를 통하는 신.
So, with regard to the reason for why we see things, so it could be because of imprints, having left imprints in the past, because of the parts of the object, those parts of the object coming together. So, on the basis of that, we perceive things. So that's like, that would be like, you can see a person when there's a scarecrow. So okay, so let's talk about like a robot, for instance. So nowadays we have like robots, so like machines that really look like a living being. So in the past they were like you had scarecrows, and nowadays you have like robots basically that look like human beings. And so because of our imprints, we perceive that robot to be like a human being. And so from the external appearance, they're very similar to a human. The only difference is that a human actually has a mind. But other than that, they're very similar.
Lola, when you see the man, Lola Chayaji, you are in some Lola Church, Digi Tom, do you want to change? And I'm sure you are.
So, therefore, it's from the point of view of appearance, it's from the point of view of kind of being similar, and therefore, from the point of view of appearance, from appearance to the mind, therefore we say the object is there. So then, therefore, Nagarjuna says in the third line that being dependently imputed, that is the middle way. So having said previously, that which is dependently risen, that is emptiness, so that which is empty, therefore, how does it exist? It exists by way of being dependently imputed. So that is the middle way. So when we say it is imputed, it is designated or labeled. So here it's a dependence on a convention, it's a dependence on a term that we label something, that we designate something. So, therefore, explaining what Nagarjuna says, Chandrakirti then says that different from that, therefore, phenomena exist by way of not being analyzed, not being examined. So without examining, without analyzing, then phenomena exist. They appear to the mind as in like they exist through in that way, as in like not analyzing them, not examining them, we can say that they exist.
Did you so the Tata Shato Inza and didn't win no say
So therefore, when you understand this, so phenomena do not exist from their own side, but they're not non-existent. So they do exist. They exist independent. They're dependently arisen. They're able to perform a function, but they don't exist from their own side. So this is what the last line therefore says. This is the middle way.
Oda Tenji any Tenji da shi jago kaza shuba ni Tenji mitawa shi che. Ben tita yimbi jumzengi any ramani meba. Ya ramani meba yimbi jumzengi Tenji se yon shoba. That was true.
So therefore, as Geshela explained previously, so there are 4 types of dependent arising. And because phenomena exist by way of those 4 types of dependent arising, therefore we say they do not exist from their own side. But we can also say, because they do not exist from their own side, therefore they exist dependently.
Shingi kali chini lu tuga tuzu chunga cho ane lo yaga tuzu kono kono pele titi shikai yongu yores.
So basically this is dependent arising, therefore, so dependent arising as well as the lack of inherent existence. So if you think about those again and again, then it will be natural. The natural process will be such that your negative states of mind, they will be slowly reduced, and your positive states of mind, they will slowly develop.
That the young Chanja Mahimba Chimia, Chibuni, Dina Bloni, Susuki, Kadis Pishitayanto, Namsha Jundu, Tatina Suki, Denjeti, Kadis Pishitayanto, Denjeti, Kadis Pishitayanto, Ramuni, Sieti, Dati, any Susuki, Kami Che, Duje, Tsuren, Kadis Pishitayanto, or those in the Sanso Samdama Yinayam, Yumechi, Shame.
But not just that, the next point that arises is how do we use this? How do we utilize this understanding of dependent arising? What do we do with this? What do we do with the understanding of phenomena not existing from their own side? So how to actually apply that? So this question then takes us towards how to practice, how to actually practice these ideas, kind of put them into practice.
Di Kadis Pishitani, Di Goa, the Yellow Chache, Senator, the Soy, which is only Risha Samach, Di Jensevichela, Di Nikindu, Kadis Pishitanas.
So, for instance, yesterday Geshela talked about mutual dependence or interdependence. Geshela gave the example of an airport that appeared to be great in relation to something smaller, but smaller in relation to something greater. So, based on that, if you really understand, if you have a real understanding of that, now the question that arises is, how do you apply this? How can this be useful in terms of your practice? So, of course, everyone has their own attitude with regard to how they utilize this, how they use it. So here, Geshela will share his own personal view on how to actually apply this or utilize this idea. So to give the example that Geshela himself would like to share with you here is the example of, for instance, your own accommodation. If you're not happy with your own accommodation, you don't feel happy about it, and you're not satisfied with it. So at that time, usually you compare your situation with a better situation. This is how you might usually work, as in like comparing it to something better. So if that is the case, if it's really better, well, you could just move there. If it was really better, you just move there. But if you cannot actually move, that's not a possibility for you to move to this different place, well then you can actually utilize the idea, you can use the idea or apply the idea of interdependence, of mutual dependence, and compare it to a worse place, and spend a week or two in a worse place. So after those 1 or 2 weeks in this worst place, when you return back to your place, this place which originally you thought was really horrible, now there's a sense, oh, this is nice, it's okay.
Kashi washing bachi any this kiwu meduslan anything any washing with the that's such a kiwu to the chamber then the lado Nijina things to your place. But again it's such a flowers.
So some of Geshela's friends, like sometimes they stay in a place where they're not really happy, and so they suggest to go to a nicer place, to go somewhere nicer. And Geshela recommends not to go to a nicer place. It's better to go to a worse place.
young chigi karsugure, what the kusho chigi this year, the Koran Nambache, any Joari to say that is a killing girl, and you to me down to some user.
So there's one monk who he's a Buddhist, and he accepts the existence of the 6 types of beings in different kind of realms of existence. So he accepts those beings who are in the hell realm. He accepts the existence of hell beings. So when this monk experiences problems, he starts reflecting upon how it would be like to be reborn in the lower realms or in the hell realms. So he's thinking, I'm not reborn in the hell realms, so my situation is bearable. So he's able to deal with the problem by reflecting on the hell realm. So in this, like if he's in a situation where someone who's more powerful, like harms him, for instance, so again when he experiences that kind of harm, still he thinks, well, at least I'm not born in the hell realm, so it's okay. So he's able to deal with that in that way. So he's basically able to deal with this anger in the sense that when someone harms him, he then thinks, well, at least I'm not in a worse state, such as a hell, kind of a hellish kind of state, so therefore there's no reason for him to get angry or upset. So he's able to deal with this anger and with his feeling of being upset in that way. So basically, there are different examples, other examples. For instance, if you find yourself to be very arrogant, well then just think of a person who has greater qualities. There's so many beings who have even greater qualities. And that kind of brings down that mind that feels so full of itself. Or when you feel really low about yourself, when then you reflect on someone who has less qualities, who is less fortunate and so forth. So basically, you try to keep your mind at a certain level. And at times you need to bring it down, at times you need to lift it up. So just check it out in terms of the situation, and then you can apply that kind of reasoning. So likewise, different ideas with regard to dependent arising, you can apply them in such a way. So with regard to selflessness, so we can take dependent arising, like one aspect of that is the lack of independent existence. So then there are many different levels of that lack of independent existence. So from the point of view of that, to just apply this to different situations. So So as Geshela talked about it yesterday, now in general we talk about emptiness. So all phenomena, there's as emptiness with regard to all phenomena. So we can talk about the lack of inherent existence of all phenomena. But here in particular, what we need to focus on is the fact that when we look for the I, it cannot be found.
디 금전지 거래에서나 에네 강에 용대의 참아 나시에들 차 도착기 디왕기 중대에 그랬어.
Why? Because any time we experience problems because of our holding on to the self, being attached to the self, and therefore problems and difficulties arise.
디 베지다 도티지 쉬어이나 가수그레 미지기 키주베이나 자루와 슈부디 키조나 자 슈부디레 샤바이나 마마키와 요마레 콘로사이 마레 베기징 심투 마레.
So why is this the case? Well, to tell you in short, this piece of napkin that Geshela just took. So actually, if someone were to take that away from him, were to tear it, take it away from him, then they would not get upset. Why not? Because Geshela has no desirous attachment towards this object. If someone took a scissors though, so if they took them, they would break them, Geshela would get slightly upset, would get slightly unhappy if someone took a scissors. Because Geshela has a little bit, why is that? Because Geshela has a little bit desirous attachment towards those scissors. So Geshela picks up this MP3 player, actually it's not his, but if it were his, because this is precious, he'd get really upset if someone were to take it and break it. So therefore, whether we're unhappy or not in terms of someone harming an object or not, it all depends on the degree of attachment, the degree of desirous attachment we have towards the object. So therefore, if we have no attachment, if we have no desirous attachment for the self, then no matter what people do to the self, what they say about the self, etc., we won't get upset. We won't get scared, we won't get fearful, there won't be any fear, we won't get confused, we won't get angry. If there's no attachment for the self, then... So, seeing the problem as our attachment for the self, so because we have attachment to the self, therefore we experience problems. It's not just Buddhist philosophers who recognize that, but also some non-Buddhist Indian philosophers understand this. So some non-Buddhist philosophers, not all of them, but some of them say that when we say I, there's a sense that the I kind of refers to the body. So body or like the coarse types of awareness. So the sense of I or the sense of self, well, that really refers to body and mind. So it's because we consider body and mind to be precious, therefore these non-Buddhist philosophers would say, therefore we experience problems. But actually, our body, that is not the I, that's not the self. So they say, actually they come to the conclusion that that body actually, that's not the actual I. So then they say, well, the actual I is something that exists separate from the body, from the mind. So a permanent part, this independent entity. That is what they describe to be the I. So due to this philosophy, because they say, well, if someone harms my body, they're actually not harming me, because the I exists as a separate entity, separate from the body, as a permanent part of this entity. So they basically are able to deal with the suffering the suffering that would ordinarily arise with regard to your body by saying, well, it doesn't harm them. Why? Because the self exists as a separate entity from the body. So this kind of view, this non-Buddhist view, if you know to use it well, then it's okay. But you may also use it in the wrong way, because you may justify you harming another person, kind of beating up another person, saying, well, it's only their body, their self is different. So by reason of that kind of philosophy, they may go and beat up the other person, kill them, saying, well, because the self is separate. So it's all about utilizing or using this idea in a correct way. So actually, if you yourself are being harmed, if you receive harm, then at that time, if you think, okay, they just harmed this body, but I'm not my body, the self exists as something separate, well, that will be all right. So what is their reason for accepting such an I? Well, they say actually the body or the aggregates, the physical and mental aggregates, they're changing all the time. So they say the self is permanent, but the aggregates, mind and body, they're impermanent in the sense that a former moment and a later moment are not the same. That moment by moment, those aggregates change. Yes. And so the argument is that unless there was a self that continued all the time, so in terms of body and mind being different, but a separate kind of I that does not change, if that didn't exist, then it wouldn't be possible to say, oh, I saw that yesterday. I saw that same person yesterday, as an example. That wouldn't be possible. So Geshela, with regard to this argument, Geshela says he also sometimes has his doubts. So his doubts with regard to the fact that actually the person yesterday and the person today, they're similar. But because they're similar doesn't mean that they're the same. So we could just be mistaken with regard to our perception of that person. So actually there's a story in the scriptures, which the stories of the time of the Buddha. At the time of the Buddha, there was an elderly lady who was begging. She went around begging. and she was kind of dirty, neglected, she was quite dirty and so forth. So when she saw the Buddha, she kind of opened her arms and she was like, "My son," and wanted to embrace him. So the other monks, the elder monks, they were like, "Oh no, don't do that," because she was kind of, she looked kind of dirty and so forth. So then the Buddha actually allowed her to hug the Buddha. So the reason for her feeling like, "Oh, well, there's my son," and wanting to hug him, and eventually she did hug the Buddha, and she relaxed a little bit and then sat down and listened to the Buddha. Well, the reason for her wanting to hug the Buddha was, the Buddha explained that throughout many lifetimes, they had this relationship, her and the Buddha, in previous lifetimes, had the relationship of mother and son. So because of those imprints, she wanted to, or because of that, she wanted to hug the Buddha.
That the Luchota, Gihotapang Temaso, Tiji, Amachita Pomuchi. That could do Skidune, Bugudi Tona, Mabanichi. The Gina that she would have been like her. And Tiji, Kanchi, that she would have said, Kati in a children, they should be.
But then there's another situation that happened later in some western area of India. Geshela says he doesn't remember the name of the place. There was also a mother who gave birth to a girl. And from the moment the girl was born, she didn't have any feeling of closeness towards the girl. So usually, like a mother would feel very close to her child. But in that occasion, or at this time, there was no closeness between the mother and the child. And they were always fighting with each other. So over little things, they would always argue and fight with one another.
Any Pomodi Church, that was some of the chambers, and the virgin on the Nibet is Tuesday, Nibet hypnotist, or the Tony, any Mama, Java change, Java continue, any pushing the coverage, I want to continue. But the rich, any quick, the gentle.
And so at some point this girl, she kind of left her mother and she went to travel. She went to travel around, and she met a hypnotist. And this hypnotist, she underwent hypnosis and was able to see in a previous life, become aware of a previous life, and she understood that in a previous life, her and her mother were interested in the same boy. So they were in competition with each other, they were after the same boy.
The consumer Jung, that Maniba with the Chikares, Copa Dushibara, Amala Digituji, Yamakaragi DJ, the Chikachi.
So somehow, in the meantime, the mother also found out that was the reason for her difficulty with the daughter. That was the same reason, because of that relationship they had in the previous life. So after they become both aware, when they met again, so they basically shared their experience, as in like sharing the idea of why they didn't get along, and then eventually they, because of having talked about it, they started to get along with one another. So if that is really true, if this really happened as it's been told in this story, well, actually, how could that be? Because those two beings, the mother and the daughter, and also in the other example, well, actually their body has changed. In the meantime, they've taken on a different body from one life to the next. And the mind is also always changing. So what is that continuum, unless it were like a permanent kind of entity, what would that continuum be that enables that situation, that makes it possible that this took place? But on the other hand, if such a permanent self were to really exist, well, then the self could never change. It could not get sick, it could not get better, it could not get liberated, so the self would never change if it really existed.
Shinda Juarelana, Shindadi, Monzi Kundingi, Mama, Sadi, Lodi, Lama, Ningo.
So, with regard to the I, saying this is the I, well, actually, when we think I, that does not refer to that kind of separate permanent partners I.
Dina Shinji Kazanda, teacher Zimone, Mari, teacher Zimari, Tilo, Chaziko, Chazimone, the laws of Shinda Juarelana, that theatre was
So actually that would be like saying, well, this part is not the scissors, this part is not the scissors, this part is not the scissors. Oh, the scissors exist as a separate entity. It would be like that, kind of saying the scissors is something different, something separate. But that's actually difficult to believe, that the scissors exist as a separate entity that is permanent, that does not change. That is hard to believe, that instead of this object, there's something separate that is permanent. If that were the case, well then the table would be something totally different. The person teaching Dharma would be a different person. So it would be absurd in terms of all the objects as like existing as something separate. But actually, from a Buddhist point of view, this view of the self as like being permanent, partless, independent, existing as separate from mind and body, that is not accepted. Why? Because it says it goes against reasoning, it goes against logic, in the sense that it doesn't make sense that there's such an I that doesn't change, that exists separately. So again, that previously gave some reasons for why it doesn't make sense. And so when we think I, on top of that, Gemma says, on top of that, our sense of I, taking for instance animals who also have a general, a very natural sense of an I, they don't perceive their I as being something permanent, partless, and independent of mind and body. So actually, the sense of this person did this to me, they did that to me, I do this to them, etc. So the sense of I, if it really were the case that there was such a sense of a permanent, partless, independent self, that would be like saying we have a sense of the space in front of us being the I. And that's not the case. So from the point of view of reasoning, from the point of view of logic, that's why such a self can't exist. And so, why is it, from the point of view of the purpose, that if there's no purpose for kind of following such a self? Well, the reason being that if we perceive the body and the mind to be impermanent, changing, and the self to be separate, like a separate permanent entity, that perception does not help us in our effort to reduce this attachment. Why can we not eliminate our attachment with regard to that? Because there's a sense, this is mine, this is my body, this is my mind. So unless this kind of attitude is changed, attachment in that way cannot be reduced, cannot be eliminated. So how can we remove this attachment towards this is mine, this is mine, this, that, and the other? How can we reduce it? Eliminate it?
콜라니 자고 문자에나 딱공 알고 문자에 계셔 지기로 디다 자셔 지 제대셔 지 디균전 테스트와 그래서는 그게 고문자들이 디다 쳐로 왔다.
So to give you an example, for instance, Geshela says, if I were to own $100 and this person 100 rupees, so Geshela says I should be the one who has the US dollars. So I have $100 and the other person has 100 rupees. Well, actually, here from the point of view of the value of those two types of this money, it's obvious that the $100 are more precious, have a greater value than the 100 rupees.
이내가 크기 자고 문자디다 내기 자고 문자디 진단치 붙이잖아.
Well, if both Geshela himself and someone else had 100 rupees, well, then the value would be the same.
제디 파게디 제네제 미기키는키 맞춘 신데요 말에 개개디요 말.
But with regard to the other person's 100 rupees, Geshela is not at all concerned about this other person losing the money, the money being torn, etc.
다디 치도나 내가 로는 그래가 신경제를 삼아디지도.
But with regard to Geshela's own money, those 100 rupees that belong to Geshela, well, these Geshela will look after. He considers to be precious. He will look after.
디를 제제제 파게디를 제제 마치에 제거도 가네쇼도 린다 집어지냐 다 제거 가네쇼르스는 디니 말에 디니리스 디모도 신의 굉장히도.
So therefore, why do we cherish those two different? Well, we cherish 100 rupees. This 100 rupee note we cherish. The other one we do not cherish. What is the reasons for that different? Although they have the same value, why do I cherish one and I don't cherish the other? Well, the only difference is because one is mine and the other one is not mine.
제사다 부모들 차버기 그때와디 다 내기 세 선호들을 토대 인상 길을 교화마다 제사 딜라고 결함이 초진의 되자기 강에 제기도 되자매고 서버 지다 초진의 내 나기 세 다고쟁 마디 교화레스페 중생기 토네 로생기를 유해가와 디강의 양조 중생기 때버스 결함이 동행이 싸워도 때버스 해야 되었어요. 동행이 카드들을 동행에 세버 지다 초진의 로아타와 디스마타는 대기라고는 데스 자신 충을 전에 동네스리기 위해서 잡으시다 초신다 진에 동네기 싸워도 때문에 당시에 두었어. 지금 디기 동네세 두고 믿으시 있다와디.
So basically, with regard to our aggregates, with regard to this mind and body complex, well, it is because of our attachment towards mind and bodies. It's our attachment towards the aggregates that is the reason for all our trouble. That is why we experience problems and difficulties. So that's what we have to reduce. So on one hand, we understand we need to reduce this attachment, but on the other hand, there's the sense of mine. This is mine. So there's a natural sense, there's an innate sense of my body, my aggregates. And so basically, every time we kind of think about this, we stabilize this, we make this stronger, this sense of this is mine. And this is what we really need to deal with. So with regard to the attachment, what we really need to deal with is this, with the sense of this being mine, which we keep stabilizing, which we kind of familiarize ourselves again and again. We kind of stabilize it all the time.
디지털에 된지기 토네 아니 다 내기 수분 내기 센 다볼때 내기 로가지 로지 로가지 다들 타데비다 뭐 타데비다 된지지 민두 세에 타셔버리나 신이 내기 세에 요샤 세지 서면은 대두에 디지털에 신이 그리 되잖아요. 소도그레스.
So in this way, therefore, with regard to my body, my mind, the sense that there is an independent self, a separate self, a self that exists as being a different nature from mind and body. So once we understand that such a self cannot exist, then we can understand that what we perceive is mistaken. And when we understand that, based on that understanding, we can therefore then reduce or eliminate attachment.
디지털에 나단 얘기시에디 단류기 따바레스 다디 넘버지 계시요 보다 류기 따바레스디라 다사시 이네 가르를 때에 따르시다 풍부를 때에 따르 다와서 번나 동바지를 나다바이나 다디 주만이 하고 두고봐 디 트리버레스 하고 두고 다 Ngalana ya Kejati, Yana Milana, Tigla, Panato Bachila, Yana Chujaki, Michila, Milana, Ti, that Norwales, Tila to God. Tada, Mi Pumu, said the Milana, Chojini, Norwale, Tapare, Geshe already, Chojini, and tell me, Kejati of war.
So then with regard to I and mine, well, in general, from a Buddhist point of view, we label, the mind labels, the awareness labels I or mine. So here, this is what, based on what do we label I or mine? It is based on the aggregates. On the basis of the aggregates, we label I or mine. If we were to label it just on space, well then it would be obvious that we're mistaken. So taking I, or Geshela suggests, well, taking human, for instance, when we label human. Now, with regard to a robot, taking a robot, for instance, when you impute a robot when you impute human on the basis of this robot, it's quite obvious that we're mistaken with regard to that. But here we're talking about our sense of the person imputed on the basis of body and mind.
Pungo said, the Supure said, Yabe Tower, Krishajet in a tower, and in a tower, that you that Kazanava, Tarim, that to chain, that Chunjo, that Chunjo put dealing. Delay Chayana, Dielo Tower, and a Samalo Tower in a Tapanatonga level, she was having to say, that's something that is legal, the Nabi Kashira.
So then we impute the person on the basis of a human body and mind. So here, the person being imputed on the basis of mind and body, if then we take the basis of imputation, the body itself, again, that is just imputed on the basis of its parts. And then those parts in turn are again merely labeled, merely imputed on the basis of their parts. So you can trace it back, you can go further and further and further, until you reach the subtlest particles, like a subtle particle, an atom for instance. So when you take an atom, again, actually that can be subdivided, and again, the atom has been labeled on the basis of its parts, and those parts have been labeled on their parts. So if you go on endlessly, you will never find anything. And so some Buddhist scholars, some Buddhist philosophers would then say, well, that is the same as labeling I on the basis of space. So they would therefore say that when you kind of go deeper and deeper, that subtler and subtler, at some point you reach a particle that is partless, the smallest particle that you can no longer divide. They would say this is the So therefore then they would say this is the ultimate, this is reality. So there's something that is no longer labeled on the basis of something other than itself because it can no longer be subdivided. That is the ultimate. And then based on that, all the coarser objects, they say, exist and appear to the mind. But then, with regard to that assertion, a question arises. If there's really the smallest particle, do these smallest particles, like two of them, if you have two of them, do they actually touch one another? If you have two smallest particles, do those two, can they actually touch one another? So then with regard to this question, can those two atoms actually touch one another? Well, there's two possibilities. Either they touch in one place, but not in another place, or the parts of each of these particles, they would touch everywhere. Every part of these particles would touch everywhere else. And then they would become one. They would be one. And on the basis of they're merging together into one, how could coarser particles or coarser objects arise from that? So that's the other possibility. Either they merge into one, or one part of one particle touches the other particle, but the other part does not touch the other particle. But that is again difficult because then it would have parts, and it would be in contradiction to their assertions that it's partless. Therefore, they come up with the solution saying they don't touch. They don't touch. Those partless particles don't touch. So if they don't touch, you can't bring them together. And so the question that arises is there space between them? Will there be space between those two particles? So basically, the Buddhist philosophers described as the Vaibhashika and the Sautantrika, they would say that they're partless particles. So with regard to the assertion of partless particles, the question that arises would be, can those two be attached? Can these two particles be brought together? And if not, is there space between them? That's the question that would arise. So in response to the Vaibhashika would say that there is empty space between them. There is some space between those partless particles, but they do not. You cannot touch them. You cannot kind of put them together. So there's space in between. And then, in terms of the question, well, how, if you have space in between, how can those particles be the basic building blocks of coarser objects if they're actually not getting together? And in answer to that, they say it's from the point of view of the substances, from the point of view of the energy that keeps them together, and therefore they do become the smallest building blocks and are able to kind of their assembly leads then to coarser objects, or makes it possible to have like coarser objects. That's their response. So then the followers of the Sautantrika, in response to that debate, they would say that nonetheless there are partless particles, but they say if those partless particles, if there was some empty space between them, then darkness could actually go in between, or light could go in between, and that doesn't make sense. And so they would argue they do not touch, but there's also no space in between. Now that's contradictory, saying that they do not touch, but at the same time there's no empty space between them. That's actually a contradictory assertion. But then the Chitta Matra, the Buddhist philosophers called the Chitta Matrins and the followers of the Madhyamika, the Madhyamika system, they do not assert partless particles, and they set forth different reasons that supports the non-existence of those particles. So their arguments against partless particles would be, for instance, if there were an object, if there were a partless particle, a tiny particle, if it were partless, it wouldn't have different sides. And if it didn't have different sides, you could not have the sun or light coming from one side and then a shadow being thrown at the other side. That wouldn't be possible if there were a particle. Does that make sense? What I just said?
디나신다 비자제의 우마라 차직들의 투 차직들의 마토는 비자제예요. 차담제는 투 집어지게 수치게 집어도는 비자제의 우마라. 비자제는 구조제예요. 말 구조제에 마이나 아니 시루조 충루조에다 파도 수조 남샤상하다 그랬어.
Another argument would be if there are no different sides with regard to this particle, you couldn't push one side and not push the other side. So you couldn't move things. And then, if that were impossible, then small particles could not be rearranged in such a way that they are moved and rearranged in order to form something coarser.
다 가실이다 딘지 두진다 카도메 입메나 아니 또 샤스케미도 요리 나부터 딘지 샤이스 다 이드지 왜 진짜 야 차시 차도로 또 보이네 차시데 가리네고 샤시메데 이도 샤이퍼요 말아.
And others would argue, well, if these particles don't have a color or a shape, well, then they couldn't appear to the mind. We couldn't perceive them. And so therefore, if you say they have a shape, that's already a part, something other than itself. You have a part. So saying something has a shape means it's not partless.
다 딘지진이 두진두즈다 딘지체버체 어디서네 다 두진디 다 차시 명이지 샤마도 차시 용이지 계시 어디서네 다 딘지기 주주세디 차시 디디디가 디리 노스디가 양 계시 어디야 주주세 명이지 차 어디서네 아니 다다 센자베이 갈래도 있어요. 아니 쉐버리 로스 파존 수 넘버 때디니지 자원이요 말이스. 수리된도 주거지요 말이스. 다디데.
So then, with regard to these particles, now if they have parts, then which part of them is the particle? You have that question again. You cannot find anything because is it that part of the particle? Is it that one? What is the particle? So in response to that, therefore, the Chitta Matrans, the Mainoli school, they come up with this, or they explain this philosophy of phenomena. They set forth the philosophy of material objects not existing externally, but rather being a mere appearance to the mind. In the sense that these external phenomena, they do not exist as external phenomena, as in like separate from the mind. So what we perceive to be external phenomena, they do not exist externally as separate from the mind.
치료는 다 넘버 때디니 주님에나 다 요마리야 되기다가는 요마리라 되네. 다 간지를 장미도 뭐 통부도 가르치디 다 미난다 지거레스.
So if they don't exist externally, we do have to say that they're there, they appear to us. And in response to that, they would say they're just like in a dream. We're just dreaming about these objects. So according to the view of the Chitta school, we're all dreaming right now. So there's actually nothing externally there. They're just these objects appearing to our mind like in a dream, according to this particular system. So then, there are a lot of different explanations with regard to this kind of philosophy. Now, the question that arises is, why do these phenomena appear to our mind? And in answer to that, they say it's because of imprints. Different imprints we've left on the mind. So different imprints we've left in this life or in the previous life. And most of the appearances, when they're similar, this is because of an imprint that is described as an imprint that is of a similar type. So because of an imprint of a similar type, we have again and again similar types of experiences. But that's just like in a dream, and actually that's what happens in a dream, that we have a similar experience while we're awake, and then we have such an experience because of imprints that are similar, we have a similar experience while we're sleeping. So they use these examples to say this takes place all the time, that it's because of these different imprints that these different appearances arise.
다 디 코로나기 계제 시에 있잖아요. peji yore, ta pedi lo la chaya la yabo yore. Kisi pe korang la ichi meba yine, lo la chaya la yabo yore, lo la chaya pedi shinta la chaya.
So actually there's an example that they use. So in terms of making it easier for us, for this idea to arise to our own mind. And so if it doesn't arise easily, we can use a different example. But they use this one particular example.
Pedi karesana, ane chu papa kala, mi gita, haji gita, itaji gita, disane, ita gita tu ene yana tongba, yana na chada, zokwa ikande wo tonggo hares. Ha gita tu zane pyuji tonggo hares. Mi gita tu chu jitango tonggo hares.
So the example they use is that of a vessel that is filled with liquid. So when a preta being, for instance, looks at that vessel, either they perceive it to be empty, or they perceive, in that vessel they perceive pus and blood. A celestial being would perceive ambrosia, would perceive nectar, while a human being would perceive water. So if there really was this liquid, if it existed in and of itself out there, if it existed out there, then two of those three beings must be mistaken, because it can only be either water or nectar or pus and blood.
Susigi milamna shinchine susigi shebi paja sebe wana ngreji and dikin duke yomare kora idadi paja sen na tubare mi paja sen chu tubare susu tumonde mato tumma iba susu mato tumonde dire seji susu yomares.
So if you say that it's just like in a dream, that would explain that situation, in the sense that there's no external object over there, but it's rather that it's because of the imprints that the preta being has, due to their unique imprints, therefore they perceive this to be pus and blood. Due to the unique imprints of the human being, they perceive that to be water, and likewise with regard to the celestial being. So they all have their unique perception of this particular object due to their imprints.
The pedi shindajirana mazulo the chadeo musara insan yeding jirana.
So actually, it would be better to have another example that is more contemporary, that's easier for us to understand.
Chidanda tinjichi yore the hidi the is chavadare kasa diji yore lamanchi. Kora kandisi kandri kora neji rachinpa. Neji rajudisane shinji tongwa, shindongchi. Shindong de tong in Zampara Shirgi the Tika, Shindong Yadadikana, Queens. Miss Amachatio, Sujidians. Harris, Shirgi the Panama Shasons. Panama Shah, never Shindong Bruce. She's a daddy, Josira, Ibototo. She Sujidin, the position together. Timoteo, the Shindora to me, Shindova Shahis. The Tobishin.
So there's a story of a lama who went to some mountain, as a form of a pilgrimage. And when he was near that mountain, there was like a tree. So in that area there was a tree. So he took his religious robes and put it up on that tree. And so other people came along and they started prostrating towards this robe. They were saying, he's just hung it in the space. He's just hung this robe in space. So they were so amazed at it, they generated faith because of this rope being just in space. And so the Lama said, no, I just hang it there. I just hung it there.
That digitization is that the Shindong de Maton, Shirgi de Tongo, Sugar Panama, you go to Tongo.
So actually, from the point of view of this Lama, this particular Lama, he could see the tree. So this was the unique appearance of this tree only he had. Whereas the other people couldn't see the tree, they could only see the religious robe. So to them, it seemed as if the religious robe was just kind of floating in space. So nowadays, there are not a lot of people who have miraculous powers. So, but actually, if someone has like miraculous abilities, then this would be a good example. This would be an example that could be cited.
딩이 그거 세줘야 돼. 세대 다다 내 생일지 아니 배는 추가로 또 추디 배 차고를 거. 저셔 뒤잖아. 아니 그 딩거. 그래서 코라 추가로 거. 코라를 차고 또 시작하고 봐. 다가는 가면 차고디 가 줘대. 또 미가 항상 가르쳤으면 이게 저것도 정거더라. 이게 항상 차고. 이게 저거래.
So here, this is like with regard to, or the reason for being able to do these special, or having these special abilities, is because of very stable concentration. So if someone generates very stable concentration, they visualize in a space where there's, for instance, water. In a place where there's water, they visualize there to be soil, or they're like a ground, like a solid ground. And it's due to their concentration, very stable concentration, that this becomes what they perceive. They actually perceive solid ground, and they can walk over water. Because for them it's not water. For us what we perceive is water, but what they actually perceive is the solid ground. So with this type of very stable concentration, you were able to engage in these kind of special miraculous power, these special feats. You were able to kind of walk over water, etc. So while Geshela was at Drepung, while he was studying in Drepung, there were some Westerners who came. So the Western philosophers came to Drepung and gave a talk. So when they explained different Western philosophies, they talked about some philosophers that were very similar to the mind only, or the Chitta Madra system. And then others were quite similar to the Madhyamika, or middle way system. So at that time the monks were encouraged to ask questions, and when they were explaining, when they were describing the system, the Western philosophical system that is similar to the mind only, or the Chitta Madra school, Geshela asked a question. So Geshela's question was, if phenomena only appear because of imprints ripening, then in the same way as, like usually when you see something, if you put it in front of you, then you can see it. When you put it to the side, you can no longer see it. But if it's merely because of imprints ripening, then you no longer have to put something aside in order to not be able to see it, or put it in front of you in order to be able to see it, because it's just imprints. If you have the imprint to see it, you will see it. If you don't have the imprint, you won't be able to see it. But that's the same for you in terms of the Chitta Madra school, the other person says. So there's the same argument, the argument that you're bringing forth, you could apply this also to the Buddhist school of the Buddhist Chitta Madra school. So Geshela said, like later on, he thought if he had to answer this from the point of view of the Buddhist Chitta Madra school, how would he answer that? He thought about it. I think I understood it now. So Geshela said that in response to that, he was thinking, well, actually, when you dream about this, the scissors in front of you, like in your dream, either it's here or it's there. But actually, also this question with regard to the scissors, that will also be part of the dream. So it would not be separate. Even now, when Geshela answers this question, that would also take place in a dream. So it would be like you're like in this process of answering this question, both takes place in the dream. Like it's the dream within the dream in the sense that basically there are those who are aware of something being a dream. So in the sense that both would take place in the dream. So you would ask the question, and then with regard to the scissors being here and there, they would all be part of the dream. So actually, going back to the Madhyamika system, so from the point of view of the Madhyamika school, it is said that phenomena, when you analyze them, you will not be able to find them. So those objects that we impute, that we label, those objects cannot be found. And actually, the sense that when you sit on a throne, for instance, so the sense of like, I myself am sitting on a throne, there's a sense of shock when you start, or like fear, when you look at this throne, in terms of this throne. So when you analyze it, you cannot find it. Why is there such a sense of like surprise or even fear? Because we have the natural sense that the eye is really there, but then the throne is not there. So we look for the throne, we cannot find it, but because of our strong sense of an eye, it's like the throne disappears, but the eye is still there. Now, with respect to the mind-only school, so their view is that phenomena do not exist externally, so that there's no external phenomena. But then there's only the mind that perceives those phenomena. And when they analyze the mind, when they kind of check the mind, or with regard to the mind itself, the mind, there's like there's an entity, or there's a mode of true existence, that the mind actually truly exists, while the objects don't exist externally, but the mind itself exists truly. Now, with regard to the mind-only school, therefore, they say the mind exists truly, but the phenomena don't. With regard to the Madhyamika school, the Madhyamika system, in general, they say that phenomena only exist because they appear to the mind. But then there are those, the Madhyamika Svatantrika, or as they're also described as the middle way autonomous school, they would say that, yes, phenomena exist merely through appearance to the mind, or they only exist by way of the mind, but they also can be found. They're not just merely labeled, but they can actually be found. Something can be found. So the consequentialists, that is the Madhyamika Prasangika, the high school, they would say that not only do phenomena only appear to the mind, they exist by way of appearing to the mind, but even within the appearance to the mind, even within that, they cannot be found. So they do appear to the mind, but they cannot be found. But then they do exist, so we need to explain how phenomena actually do exist. So they do not exist in the way Gemma said, but they still exist. So how do we determine that they exist? Well, if they're not contradicted by valid cognition. So therefore, in that way, there are these different views, coarser and subtler views, from the point of view of these different Buddhist philosophical systems. And with regard to that, they set forth the explanation. They set forth the selflessness of the person and selflessness of phenomena other than the person. So basically, these philosophers, they explain selflessness of the person from the point of view of, once you realize that, on the basis of realizing the selflessness of phenomena, so selflessness of person, you eliminate afflictions and you attain liberation. Then the realization of the selflessness of phenomena, based on that, from the point of view of the selflessness of phenomena, you eliminate cognitive obscurations and attain the state of a Buddha. So this should be enough for today. If you have any questions, we have half an hour left for questions.
So we have been looking at philosophies from various systems. So I would like to know, according to the Madhyamaka Pratamika system, which is the middle way consequentialist.
Yeah.
So the question has two parts. The first part is, in the view of emptiness or shunyata, what is their assertion on Buddha nature? And the second question is, doesn't this Buddha nature hint towards an Atman, inherent permanent self? And
A permanent self?
Inherent permanent which is contradictory to the Buddhist assertion of Anatman.
Okay. I repeat the question. So his question is, after Geshela explained different philosophical systems, his question is in particular with regard to the Prasangika, the Madhyamika Prasangika system, the middle way consequentialist system. So with regard to the view of emptiness, what is Buddha nature? And then when Buddha nature, the way Buddha nature is explained, doesn't that actually refer, the way the Prasangika school would set forth Buddha nature, wouldn't that imply like an inherently existent, an inherent and permanent self, and therefore be in contradiction to the view of Anatman? So from the point of view of Buddha nature, it's said to be twofold. So one is said to be naturally abiding Buddha nature, and the other one is expanding Buddha nature. So when we talk about naturally abiding Buddha nature, that refers to emptiness. So when we say emptiness, it's like it's described as the lack of inherent existence. So it's kind of like saying the lack of natural existence, as it can also be translated. So it seems like the lack of natural existence, that's the nature of things. So it seems to be contradictory to say, on one hand, phenomena lack inherent existence or lack natural existence, and still that is the nature of things. So there could be a misunderstanding in terms of seeing those two as contradictory. So to say in a different way, for instance, when we say lack of inherent existence, that is the truth. That is truth. So that seems to be seems to imply that phenomena exist truly, which seems to be contradictory. It's a truth, but it exists and it doesn't exist truly. So that seems contradictory. So basically, the lack of natural existence of the mind is the nature of the mind. But it's not the nature of the lack of natural existence of the mind. Right? Why? Because the lack of natural existence of the mind is not the nature of the lack of natural existence of the mind, because it's actually because in relation to no, because it's not so the lack, I'll say it slightly differently. So the lack of inherent existence of the mind is not the truth of the lack of inherent existence of the mind, but it's the truth of the mind itself. So therefore, it itself actually exists falsely. It's not, so the lack of inherent existence is not the nature of the lack of inherent existence of the mind, is not the truth of the lack of inherent existence of the mind itself, because it exists falsely. So it itself is not its own nature, in other words. So the lack of inherent existence of the mind is not its own nature, it's the nature of the mind. So because it is in relation to the mind that it is its nature, so the lack of inherent existence is the nature of the mind, so it's an dependence on the mind that it becomes its nature, so it doesn't exist in and of itself as its nature, because it's dependent on the mind. So that doesn't mean that the self exists. Just because that being the case doesn't mean that there is an existent self, an Atman. But actually, when we talk about Buddha nature, usually it's easier for us to understand Buddha nature from the point of view of the clear and knowing nature of the mind. To say that our mind, its nature is to be clear and knowing, and it's free from the stains in the sense that they're not the nature of the mind, and that we can purify the mind from these stains and attain the state of a Buddha. That is for us easier to comprehend versus understanding that the emptiness of the mind is Buddha nature. But saying that it's the lack of inherent existence of the mind, that this is Buddha nature, it comes from the point of view of understanding that if this exists, if the mind does not exist inherently, then it can actually engage in activities, it can function, it can be transformed such that it becomes the mind of a Buddha. So because it lacks inherent existence, therefore everything becomes possible. It becomes possible to transform the mind into the mind of a Buddha.
간제다 심라문에 매버디 검샤두자네 문에 매버디 검디 디세로 전에 세에 벤디 조조디 산지로 디냠차로 대제기 돈에 고발해 보러.
So also another way of explaining why the lack of inherent existence of the mind is Buddha nature is that once this becomes clear, so it becomes clear to us that this is the nature of our own mind. And when we finalize that clarity, in the sense that it becomes clearer and clearer and clearer, so once we reach this final level with regard to this being totally clear to our own mind, well, that is the level of Buddha. That's another way of looking at it.
진짜 디가나 산제기 셈 라문에 매버디다 다 수세 셈 라문에 매버디 뭐지 그랬어. 인지기 돈에 에너지 some question.
So therefore, the lack of inherent existence of the mind of a Buddha and the lack of inherent existence of our mind right now, they are of one nature. They are of one nature. They cannot really be differentiated. So from that point of view, we can also say that we can also understand that the lack of inherent existence of our mind is Buddha nature.
단도 슈르레기 제시 디르주문을 야부신규 등산신규 르주문 다만 뭐지 이메차래 산지기 레스 디기톤의 상기 루인버지 르주문을 야부지 다 같이 제조했는 등산 용문도 큰에 나가지는 셈이 차고.
So Geshe says this latter explanation, the explanation with regard to the two types of emptiness not being of a different nature, 10 years ago Geshela could explain this really well. Now he's just using those words, but it doesn't really appear to his mind. Whatever happens, but it doesn't appear as clearly to his mind as it used to 10 years ago. All of you improve more and more, your understanding gets better. Geshela's understanding is degenerating, it's declining.
When we do not differentiate objects, there seems to be still an observer in emptiness. So what I'm wondering about is there any difference between this emptiness and the conscious observer?
So you're saying there seems to be a difference?
Yeah, so I'm wondering
whether there's a difference. 또니도가 대제나 유다 유진이 켜봐서 지어졌어. 유다 유진한다 유동이다 아니지 유 칼로다 지금 넣어줘 시가 상당히서다 유 유진. 다 진이를 켜봐 여러분. 유 유진. Oh, sorry, I forgot to repeat the question. So to make sure I understood it correctly, so you're saying in terms of the realization of emptiness, there still seems to be a difference between the mind that perceives emptiness and emptiness.
Yes.
다 돈이 또 어디잖아요. 먼저 배나 다 조지디 또 어디 조지 유디 파조듯이 아니 조지 통행이 어디 수조듯이 조지 미다바에 나바이네 디나시 미다바에 파조듯이 디나시 다 차도요 말이에요.
So when you realize emptiness, so actually with regard to, for instance, you perceive this table with your mind. There is a sense not only do you perceive this table, but there's also a sense the table is over here, the table is over there, and the mind is over here. Or if you think, for instance, of the impermanence of the table. So the impermanence is over there, the impermanence of the table is over there, the mind is over here. The sense of a distance. That is not the case with regard to perceiving emptiness.
제상 돈이 또비 커도 다가는다 돈이 또비로 코랑기 통수치는 디니 요체요 말. 무슨 말하는 지요. 말하는 지도 그지.
With regard to when you realize emptiness, there's not that distance. There's not such a sense of the object over there, the mind over here. That difference is not there.
다 이내 돈이 또 사비 제다. 다히 얘기 생기니 다 분배돈이는 분배기다 내주를 또송라디 다기기 셈들의 유다 유진이를 제다 통해요.
이양도 직장제로서
말이.
제일
또 그랑이 장치 통말로. 이내 유진이를 제기 또 뱉다는 그랑이의 심주제나 디비제 디유에서 제기해요.
So actually at the time when you realize emptiness, in that moment, there's no sense, from the point of view of that mind perceiving emptiness, there's no sense that the emptiness is over there and the mind is over here. But when later on, when you rise from that realization with another mind, you can still differentiate between the two. Oh, that was the object, that was the mind. So you can explain them differently. repeat the question. There's one question with regard to emptiness. When he looks at the pillar, he sees this golden kind of garlands, you call them, right? This golden kind of painting. So he sees that, but then he also sees a stupa inside it. So your question is that a mistaken perception or not?
Is it a good contemplation that goes towards understanding and how to go further? Or is it just my mind playing tricks?
Are you saying, is this a good example for emptiness?
Is it a good contemplation and how to go further?
Is that a good contemplation? So I kind of checked, does that connect to emptiness? That's how I put forth the question. And so he says, yes, that can, actually there's a way in which you connect that to emptiness. So for instance, when Geshela looks up towards the mountain, he sees these beautiful mountains up there, beautiful Dharamshala mountains. So actually when he looks at the mountain, there's like this kind of meadow in between, and then there are these mountains. So it kind of looks like a jewel when you look at the snowman, a tree on it. So when therefore Geshela looks at the mountains, the thought arises, oh, the Dharamshala mountains are very beautiful. But then when he goes towards Topema, when he goes there, and he sees the mountains from the backside, he's thinking, oh, it's so ugly. So what he sees, what he saw before, and what he saw later on, very different. So basically, why did Geshela perceive this? The first perception, he perceived it so beautifully because there was this meadow and that was surrounded by the snow mountains. So because of that, in relation to each other, Geshela perceived them as being beautiful. While if he looks at it from a different angle, well then he sees it differently. So the basis of imputation is differently, and therefore the perception is different. So therefore, if his perception takes place in dependence on parts, Geshela has one perception and then another perception when the parts are different. Well, if it's only in dependence on parts, then it's possible to have different perceptions. But if the mountains existed in and of themselves, then one of the perceptions would be wrong. Would be a wrong perception if it were not to depend on parts. Is that enough?
The second part about the eye.
Should we just wait? Okay, so give us that's first. Can you speak up? So what is the difference between selflessness and emptiness? So actually, they're just different terms referring to the same. So they're synonymous. But by Bhashika in the Sautantrika school, in their scriptures they mainly talk of selflessness. They do sometimes use the word emptiness, but they mainly talk of selflessness. But then in the higher philosophical systems, when they differentiate between selflessness of person and selflessness of phenomena, then they take on the same meaning. Selflessness and emptiness have the same meaning.
Geshela talked about the way to posit phenomena as existent. Geshela talked about how the way we posit phenomena as existent that is not contradicted by valid cognition. Could Geshela maybe develop on valid cognition a little bit further, and what does it actually mean for a phenomenon not to be contradicted by it?
Time is not enough to give an explanation in those two.
That Tushita the Yona, Atina, and Tushita the Yori, Miji, or teaches to tell the Yona, Tushita the Yori, Tushita the Yori, Tuye, Geshe, Yoruba, Kariche, and Tiche, Mother, that Tani Mochi, the mother of Semachati.
So from the point of view of conventional existence here, so when we talk about valid cognition, to just give you like a brief explanation, if someone were to look for Geshe so if they were not aware that Geshela is here in Tushita, but instead they were to go to the monastery where he lives, to Techoling, well, now if they were to perceive Geshe to be down there in the monastery, that would be not a valid cognition, that would be wrong. But then, if they find out this was wrong, and so actually Geshe is not down there, but he's here, and they perceive him to be here, well, that would be a valid cognition.
That's the George, and in Jojo Tonche, and being out of Tanya. I think to them is not to but it's a
So if this person were to go to Techoling and were to meet Geshela's older brother, who looks very similar to Geshela, so if you were to meet him and you were to say, hello, Geshela, and talk to him, his mind, that awareness that perceives his brother to be Geshe Tukdumpesa, that would be a wrong consciousness, it would not be a valid cognition or valid cognizer.
Jojo Tambi got it, and read a Tam Chuore, and some days that in Magichil, there's Kamucha, and Miji Yonje, and then John Jojo, there's somebody.
So one time, Geshela's brother, his older brother, who's usually a little bit more filled out. So when he was in retreat, during the retreat, he lost a lot of weight. So he looked a little bit skinnier. And as he came out of his retreat hut, someone came up to him and said, "Is this where your brother is staying?" So they thought it was Geshe the peasant, and they were asking him about his brother.
That's just a Kyoji. Kage teacher Losheva, I should have found no shaps.
So we can differentiate, therefore, between the time when he misperceived his brother to be Geshela, so that was a mistaken perception, it was not a valid cognizer. Whereas later on, when he got here, when he arrived here, and he perceived Geshela correctly, at that time his mind was a valid cognizer. This is called a conventional valid cognizer. If, on the other hand, this person were to approach Geshela's brother and were to check who is Geshe Trupten Pesana? Is it the head? Is it the legs? Is it the arms? They can engage in that kind of analysis, not finding Geshe Trupten Pesana, and doing the same analysis on the basis of Geshe Trupten Pesana himself, not his brother, and again engaging in this analysis. This is not Geshe Trupten Pesana, this is not Geshe, and so forth. Well, in that sense, it would be the same result. You would kind of come to the same conclusion that Geshe Trupten Pesana cannot be found.
제선다 바레디 아니 게 투데베사데 젬바이나 티타니 비체오싱 뇌서 슈라 아타마 추샤세지 데다 투데베사데나 타니 비체망이 뇌서.
So in terms of whether his brother is Geshe Trupten Pesana, Gen Trupten Pesana or not, well, in the first case with regard to his brother, this is mistaken. This is not a conventional valid cognition. While when looking at Geshela himself and perceiving Geshela himself to be Geshe Trupten Pesana, that is a conventional valid cognition. Last question.
How do you cultivate detachment?
How do you cultivate detachment?
Yes.
차바다 지당 카두다 차바메바 스에나 강다 차서디 괜찮다나 차바메 차이로.
그 뒤에는 참이 ganz gut
카두 문주로 제바이나 강다 차바 제서디기 아니 괜찮다나 바이나 차바 총주로.
So kind of in a straightforward kind of way, but just reflecting on the faults of attachment. In that way, you can reduce attachment. That is, you can develop detachment.
제자한테 갈라오래 배제나로 그 뒤를 차고 제시해버리나 루미장 성당당 보지 숨겨요. 다 같이 나와주고 지금 말이야. 이것도 신고를 해지다 돼.
So, with regard to attachment to the body, for instance, so one meditation that is prescribed is looking at the ugliness of the body. There are some people that they don't like that kind of meditation, they don't like it. But actually it's something that needs to be understood, one should understand.
그래서는 로샤마나나 같이 된지다 요거다 부분은 편지 차지 디게니 차네다 되다리 뭐 주비카도다 아니 강에 시우체 그거 다 되다리 주는 지거든 Geshe 뭐 와체가 뭐 주비카도다 아니 코디 잡아도 내가 보시나 강에 영화가.
So, for instance, when you're young and like a boy and a girl, they meet each other and they have attachment, desire for one another. Of course, if everything turns out and they get together, okay. But if it doesn't turn out, if their attachment is not fulfilled, they experience a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties. So, here in that case, reducing the attachment could reduce the problem, could solve the problem.
지상다 류미장와디 선노당제 배제나 시바나 신진의 니마를 튼숨 시진의 선 뒤다지 선노당의 시작으로 조사했다.
So if you think about the here again I use a different word, not the ugliness of the body, but of the fact that the body is not clean. So of the uncleanliness or not lack of cleanness of the body, if you kind of reflect on that for a week or a month and so forth, so for an extended period of time, then your attachment for the body of the other person can be reduced.
지상다 되차 짬에 수에게 제시해보나 대기다가나신 되차기에 타도디 얘기 있어야 될 도구가 지상다 다음에 선노당 밑에 신의 짬에 수도.
But with regard to totally eliminating attachment, so to abandon, to totally eliminate it, that's when you need to understand selflessness, because as Geshela explained before, it is the sense of my body which gives rise to attachment. So because of the sense of I and mine, giving rise to attachment, therefore that's what you need to remove. You need to understand selflessness.
베나다 수수이 류미장와서는 당연히는 디기토는 류의 차신 매버 차지 류의 차신 매버 차세 비제다 시에를 심으시다 매딩에다 아니 신규도 소를 담으로 주나요 비카메시다 매딩에다 디고요.
No sé. So if you meditate on the unclean nature of the body, for instance, as a result of that, not only do you remove the attachment as explained before, but also it reduces your fear of death. Plus, it becomes easier to sacrifice your own body for others. to give up your body for the welfare of others.
Then the Shuchambo Gomenda, she tell you the Havama, the Shuchambo Gomena, and the Gachi Tigwe Lesson. Then I Yamdo, Lady Tajurbi in Bata, she went to be about a tea and Dendi, Yansano Madame, and then she came to the Namisha. The church in Mo, Miss Our Indian. Quick Chile, Tone, Naruna, she is touching with Santana, and Chashin Bedding, Kosum Job Chitting. That's it too.
But there is some danger. There can be the danger if you take it to an extreme level, which not everyone will do, but if you take it to an extreme level in terms of perceiving your body as unclean, as dirty, as ugly, etc., that you will neglect your body, no longer understanding that it's the basis for your precious human rebirth, as in like being the basis for the opportunities and leisures that you have, that you experience. And so, therefore, it is important to understand that from the point of view of its nature, it is unclean, it has lots of shortcomings, but from the point of view of its function, it is like a precious jewel. So it's important to kind of have a sense, have like a balanced sense of your body in the way just described. So this should be enough for today in terms of the session. So we conclude this session again with 2 dedication prayers. The meaning of the first one is, may the precious view of emptiness that has not arisen arise and grow. May that which has arisen not decline, but increase forevermore. And then the meaning of the second verse is, for as long as space remains, and as long as living beings remain, until then may I also remain to remove the suffering of living beings.
Thank you.